As many of you know, I've studied history, and unlike the president, I've studied American history. In 1858, Abraham Lincoln has been out of office for 10 years. He only had the House seat for 2 years. He'd been a state legislator before that. For 10 years, he'd been in private practice. He's running against the best-known Democratic senator, a man people thought was going to be president of the United States in 1860. When he announces, Lincoln says, there are 105 days left, why don't we debate every day? And Douglas says, I don't think so. So Lincoln adopts a policy. Wherever Douglas goes, Lincoln shows up the next day and answers it. And in about 3 weeks' time, Douglas figures out the newspaper coverage is consistently Lincoln's answer to Douglas. And so he sends him a letter and says, all right, I'll agree to the debates. There were 9 congressional districts back then. He says, we've already followed me in 2 of them. I'm not going back there, but I will do the other 7. And so that's how the debates occurred. They were very famous debates. I think they're the most important political dialogue since the Federalist Papers. They were widely covered across the whole country because they were fundamental. They were about the nature of freedom, the nature of the Constitution. Lincoln arranged to have them published the following year, and they were a major factor in his becoming president. So if I become the Republican nominee, and the president has not yet said yes, in my acceptance speech in Tampa, I will announce that from that date on, the White House will be my schedule. Wherever the president goes, I will go 4 hours later. But to do all that, I have to be your nominee. And to do that, I need to win delegates in New York. And to do that, I need your help. So I hope you'll decide to be with me. Chris and I both want you to feel like together, rooms like this across America are ready to replace Barack Obama, and we're ready to work with you. And now what I'd like to do is just toss it open to questions. Is that okay? Good. Yes. All right, microphone's coming to you at this very second.
Thank you for coming out and seeing us in probably the only conservative area in New York City. My name is Ben Shulman. I live right across the border of New Jersey. And I have a 3-pronged question for you, if you would please indulge me. Number 1, I would like to know, will you bring the executive branch back into compliance with the limits of the Constitution?
Yes.
How will you do that?
By campaigning on returning the 10th Amendment to enforcement, and by campaigning on other bills you can see if you go to newt.org, myfirstname.org, by getting the Congress to pass some things and by vetoing things that I regard as unconstitutional.
Thank you. And do you believe in term limits for congressmen and senators? And if so, what term limits, and how would you get them to agree to it?
I am very dubious about term limits because I've watched in California, and what they've done is they've guaranteed that the only people in town who don't know what they're doing are the legislators, because you don't have term limits for bureaucrats, you don't have term limits for lobbyists, and they've just ended up manipulating the legislature. And I am in favor of campaign reform that would enable any American to give any amount of after-tax money, as long as it's reported every night on the internet. And I think you would rapidly defeat incumbents who are out of touch. I'd like to have a 1-election term limit. If you're a bad member, let's beat you at the next election.
Yeah.
And thirdly, do you think that the Supreme Court justices should have term limits, and if so, how long and how would you get
No, I'm content with them having life appointments, but I did put a paper on reforming the judiciary at newt.org, and if you see it, it's the boldest explanation of how to reform the judiciary since Lincoln's first inaugural in 1861, and it makes very clear that if I become president, we'll have a very strong effort to reform the judiciary. Go ahead.
Hi, Mr. Speaker. Rosa Leonetti from Smart Girl Politics. We haven't heard much from you on school reform since the road show with Reverend Ann. Mr. Speaker, what are trending? We are trending toward a nationalization of our curriculum within the public schools. The Common Core learning standards being in full effect. What are your thoughts on this initiative and the one-size-fits-all educational philosophy? What are your thoughts overall on school reform?
That's a very good question, educational reform. And let me say that we had a very interesting dialogue here in New York City that I think is on our website, or linked to on our website at newt.org. It was hosted by Paul Gigot and Joel Klein. Paul Gigot is the editor of the Wall Street Journal, and Joel Klein is the former chancellor. And we spent about 35 minutes talking about very large-scale change. Let me give you an example of where I'm coming from. We were doing a book signing in Naples, Florida last Saturday rather, and about 900 people showed up. And about halfway through it, this young lady, 8.5 years old, named Katrina, walks up, and she doesn't have a book, but she has 3 questions that she's written out. And so she asked me all 3. And one was, how many presidents had I known and which one did I like most? One was, had I ever had Godfather's Pizza? And one was, what kind of a pet would we have if we got to the White House? So it was very cute, and she was very serious. And she was a young lady. She wasn't there as a child. And it turns out her mother's a reporter. She got up that morning and she said, go look up Newt on Google and learn these things. And then, she originally wrote out 12 questions, and Mom talked her down to 3. So I think it was doubly fascinating because a couple people were here covering me were there that day. The press, which was frankly bored watching Puss and me sign books, suddenly had live bait. And here's an 8.5-year-old kid, perfect stuff. So all of a sudden we looked at her, and here she is, surrounded by like 8 or 9 cameras. 8.5 years old. And she was just holding forth, chatting with them, totally comfortable. I mean, what was network news to her? Just another evening, another afternoon event. Now here's why I tell you that story. There is no possibility of a national curriculum being flexible enough to take advantage of somebody that smart, that mature, and let them grow at the most rapid rate possible and learn as much as possible. And that's why I'm opposed to any national curriculum. I would frankly dramatically shrink the Department of Education.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My name is Tony Ferrantino. I'm a Korean War veteran. When you become our Speaker, can we have your assurance that one of your top priorities will be the welfare of our veterans, past, present, and future? Thank you.
Before they start rioting, we'll get 2 or 3 questions at the very back here in a second. Let me say that, first of all, my dad was also in the Korean War, and so thank you for serving our country. He served 27 years in the infantry, so you can imagine having grown up as an Army brat, where I stand on veterans and on military services. And I can assure you that keeping our commitment to the veterans and to their families will be a very, very high priority in the Gingrich administration.
My name is Daniel Joya, and I just want to let you know that I'm 100% behind you. And quite frankly, I believe you're the deliverer to deliver us from liberals in Washington, D.C. We've seen under President Obama all the partisan bickering going on in Washington, closed-door dealings with unions, payoffs to senators in the form of pork and earmarks and bills, and even changing parliamentary procedure in order to get votes for health care. Now, how do you propose to get a consensus and to get democratic support that is so necessary to move this country in the right direction, and also your agenda?
Well, that's a very, very important question. I'm glad you asked it. First of all, when I began running in the 1970s in Georgia, you had to get a lot of Democratic support. Because in the 1970s, my district was consistently more Democrat than Republican. So I had to sweep the Republicans, sweep the independents, and get a fair number of Democrats, or I had no hope of winning. When Reagan was elected, and Reagan was always very good. Cliss and I did a movie about Reagan a couple of years ago called Rendezvous with Destiny. And there's a scene in there where Jerry Ford calls him up to speak in 1976, off the cuff. Reagan begins by saying, he's at the Republican National Convention. He begins by saying, my fellow Republicans, and those Democrats and independents around America who are listening and who share our values. And he always did that. Because Reagan wanted to be the American president, not just the Republican president. Now, when he got elected, and I played a small but pretty real role in hosting the first Capitol Steps event in history in 1980 with Governor Reagan and all the congressional and senatorial candidates. When he got elected, we didn't have a majority in the House, but Tip O'Neill was Speaker. So we always had to get about 1/3 of the Democrats to vote with us. And we got very good at grassroots organizing because we had to have folks back home remind the swing Democrats why it was better to be with us than it was to be with the liberals. And all of Reagan's programs were passed. His big tax cut, for example, you had to get 1/3 of the Democrats. You couldn't pass it. So I grew up, in politics, learning a lot about how you build bipartisan coalition. Clista was the chief clerk of the Agriculture Committee, which is very bipartisan. I was on Public Works, which is very bipartisan. And we came out of that kind of background. When we passed welfare reform, for example, we had a conversation. This is why public conversation is so important. 92% of the people in the country favored welfare reform. Now that meant that we split the Democrats evenly. 101 voted no and 101 voted yes. We had half the Democratic Party voting with us to reform welfare. So I would start and do three things. The first is I would pick very large issues. And I would try to rally the American people. Reagan described it as that he would shine the light on the American people so they could turn up the heat on Congress. And that's why I asked him to be with me, because that's a key first part. Because remember, we also got to get Republican votes, and they aren't always going to like this stuff either. Second, you try to find things that make Democrats happy that don't involve selling out your principle. I've been trying for months now to get the House Republicans to pass the Webb-Warner bill.